What's happening, everybody? UFC 302, it's taking place this weekend, and in this video, I'm going to be breaking down all of the fights, going through all of them to let you guys know all the information that you need to build some winning DraftKings lineups this weekend using the Sims tools and the data here at Stokastic.com, which if you want to sign up for, use the link below in the description box. You could build up to 10,000 lineups on our site. You could simulate them out 40,000 times. It's going to help you identify which are the best lineups to play for the slate. And then also you could customize them to put some inputs in to make the lineups more geared towards the fighters that you want to be playing. And then also one other thing, if you guys could do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and shout out to... this is a long YouTube name here. We did a giveaway for the last card, which is a couple of weeks ago. Going to be doing another giveaway this week as well. So the winner from last week, or last card, I should say, is the Rush A Gun at I Lake 1516. It was which fighter will score the most fantasy points on the card. He's the only one who got the answer correct. He went with Lerone Murphy, who ended up putting up a massive DraftKings score in a win over Edson Barbosa a couple weeks ago. For this week, I think it's really difficult to find underdogs to be confident in. So let's have some fun here. Let me know in the description box or comments. Leave a comment. Let me know which fighter priced under 8K scores the most fantasy points this weekend. One person who gets the answer correct, I'm going to give you one free subscription to OddsShopper, our betting site. So just leave a comment. Which fighter under 8K scores the most fantasy points? I'll randomly select one person who gets the right answer to go and get a free OddsShopper subscription. And for the real A-Gun Lake, whatever the hell, you had the longest YouTube handle of all time, DM me on Twitter, and I'll send you over a link and a promo code to get a free subscription. But let's start talking about this weekend's slate. Starting with the main event, Islam Makhachev is going to be defending his lightweight title, going up against Dustin the Diamond Poirier, and I don't really have all that much unique to add to the conversation here. Islam is going to be extremely popular. We have him projected for right around 50% ownership, and he's a minus 700 favorite over Dustin Poirier. By far, the most likely outcome here is that Islam is able to land takedowns. He dominates Poirier on the mat and then probably submits him sometime in the second or third round. We've seen Poirier in similar sorts of matchups, and this is generally how it goes for him in these scenarios. Islam lands north of 3 takedowns per 15 minutes, and then Dustin Poirier does not have the best takedown defense in the world. Defending takedowns is just a 63% clip. So typically, when we see Poirier going up against a fighter that is able to implement a very wrestling and grappling heavy game, they're able to dominate him. They land the takedowns. They hold a lot of top control time, and they end up getting a submission at some point. That's what's happened the last 2 times that Poirier has contended for the lightweight title. In his matchup against Khabib Nurmagomedov, how many takedowns did Khabib have in that fight? He ended up with, where is it? Here it is. Yes, 7 takedowns for Khabib before he had a third-round submission, and then also the fight against Charles Oliveira, where Oliveira didn't actually land takedowns, but he's able to get to the back of Dustin Poirier. He's able to get into control positions. He did land a reversal in that fight and still had nearly 6 minutes of control time before he had also a third-round submission in that fight. So I think that's what ends up happening here. Really, the only 2 issues that I have here with Islam, first off, it's a small slate. We only have 12 fights. And like I said, we've got him projected for nearly 50% ownership. He's projected for 47.6% ownership here. And then also Islam is $9,500. So you don't only need him to win, you need him to put up a massive score. And then on top of that, it is hard to build unique lineups with Islam. So when I first looked at the slate, I assumed I was just going to play 100% of Islam Makhachev. But then when I was running my lineups through our Sims, I started to notice, well, a lot of my lineups with Islam aren't projected to be all that creative lineups just because of how heavily duped they're expected to be. So I love Islam. He's my favorite overall play on the slate. Absolutely play him in cash games. I like him in tournaments too. I have him in half my lineups, but not quite as much as I expected to just because of some of the ownership concerns. On the other side, I have some exposure to Dustin Poirier. He's in 13% of my lineups. He's got a puncher's chance. It wouldn't be the most shocking thing in the world if he was able to knock out Islam in one of the first minutes or so of like the first or second round or something like that when the fight is taking place on the feet. But it's certainly not the most likely outcome here. So not going to have 0% of Poirier, but a very light amount of him. He's in right around 10% of my lineups. Co-main event, which, by the way, guys, is also going to be a 5-round fight between Sean Strickland and Paulo Costa. And I'm not exactly sure why it's a 5-round fight, but it is. So we get a couple of extra rounds of Strickland against Costa. And for DFS purposes, Costa's my favorite punt play of the slate. And I think this is a really good fight to target because of the expected output. Strickland lands 5.91 significant strikes per minute. Costa lands 6.2. Costa also absorbs a ton of damage. He absorbs 6.38. He's very hittable. I think Strickland's going to land a billion jabs on him in this fight, but Strickland also doesn't have a ton of power. So I do think that if there's a finish, it's more likely to come on the Costa side. What I think is the most likely outcome in this fight is that it takes place on the feet. It's going to be a very high volume striking affair. It probably goes to decision. And I think Strickland wins, landing something like 160 significant strikes or something along those lines. If you look at the other 5-round fights Strickland has been in, against Duplessis, even though it was a loss, he landed 173 significant strikes. In his win over Izzy, he had 137 significant strikes. In a win against Nasruddin Imavov, 182 significant strikes. In a loss to Jared Cannonier, 152 significant strikes. 186 significant strikes against Uriah Hall, 153 against Jack Hermanson. You guys get the idea. 5-round fights, they usually end up getting extended by Strickland, and there's just a ton of output in them. So one of the reasons I like Costa, even though I don't expect him to win, is there are so few underdogs that I feel good about. Number one, Costa is live to win. I don't think he has a 0% chance to win. But on top of that, even in a loss, we could see Costa land 120, 130 significant strikes and end up scoring like 50 to 60 fantasy points in a loss. I think he's very live to be in a winning optimal GPP lineup with 50 to 60 fantasy points, even in a loss. So I like Paulo Costa a good amount. And then even on the Strickland side, even though I don't think he has a ton of finishing equity, just because his strike output is so high and he's only $8,800, I think he's also a pretty good pay-up option. So for cash games, I think you could absolutely stack the Paulo Costa-Sean Strickland fight. I think you're locking in a lot of guaranteed points there. I don't think it's all that likely to finish early. So Strickland Costa, I have this fight in just about all my lineups right now, close to 50-50, which has me well overweight to the Costa side, and then a little bit overweight to Strickland. We've got Strickland projected for about 40% ownership, Costa projected for about 30% ownership, Costa being in 50% of my lineups. He is my preferred side to play relative to ownership in the co-main event. Next fight here, we have Kevin Holland against Mikhail Oleszejczuk, and I think this is a pretty good matchup for Kevin Holland. Also, Oleszejczuk has been submitted, I think 5 times in the UFC, and I know that Kevin Holland doesn't go into fights with the best game plan in terms of optimizing his win percentage. He's usually going in to kind of try to have a fun fight and put on a show for the fans, but it would really be in his best interest to wrestle and grapple in this fight. If he does that, I think he wins by submission fairly easily. But even if he doesn't and the fight takes place on the feet, Oleszejczuk has kind of questionable durability. He's also very hittable. He absorbs 4.26 significant strikes per minute. Last fight for Oleszejczuk against Michel Pereira, even though it was a submission win for Pereira in a little bit over a minute, he really badly hurt Oleszejczuk to the body in that fight. And then also, there's going to be a massive reach advantage for Kevin Holland. He is 6'3" compared to 6 foot tall for Oleszejczuk, so 3 inches taller. But look at the 7-inch reach advantage. 81-inch reach for Kevin Holland, 74 inches for Oleszejczuk. I think at distance, this is Kevin Holland's fight to win. If they do get in close, I think Kevin Holland could land takedowns and end up getting a submission once he gets some control time there. But what I do think is probably the most likely outcome, just because Kevin Holland doesn't look to wrestle all that much, is I think Holland probably wins the fight. And I'm going to say that he wins the fight by finish as well. I would love to see him go to his wrestling, but once again, kind of hard to count on him for that. If I did have a good idea that Holland was going to try to wrestle, I would go out and I would bet Kevin Holland to win by submission. He's like plus 500. I think he's a massive advantage in that department. But as far as contrarian plays go on the high end, there's a ton of ownership going to Islam. There's a ton of ownership going to Sean Strickland. There's a bunch of ownership going to Jailton Almeida, who we're going to be talking about in a little bit as well. And Kevin Holland's one of these pay-up options that has a real ceiling that isn't picking up as much ownership as these other fighters. So Kevin Holland at 23% ownership. I like him as a pay-up option to differentiate in lineups, to get off of some Islam or get off of some Sean Strickland exposure. Nico Price against Alex Morono. And I think Nico Price is super washed at this point in his career, which sucks because he was a really fun fighter to watch for a long time. But you just look at the recent fights that Nico Price has been in. Finished by Robbie Lawler in 38 seconds. Finished by Phil Rowe. Did have a win over Alex Oliveira. And then before that, had a loss against Michel Pereira, had what was, it was a split decision, or I think this was actually a majority decision, but it was a draw against Cowboy Cerrone, got KO'd by Vicente Luque, but the last fight was really concerning for me. The last two really for Nico Price, because he took a ton of damage in the third round against Phil Rowe before being finished. And then after that, he follows that up by just getting KO'd with like the first shot that Robbie Lawler landed on him. And if you guys see Nico Price come into the octagon for a lot of his fights, he's wearing like massive, massive knee braces. He's had lots of knee issues. His chin is gone at this point. So while he's not super old on paper, Nico Price is 34 years old, Nico Price. In terms of fight years, he has just suffered so many injuries, taken so much damage that I just don't really trust him. I don't trust his durability. If this was Nico Price a few years ago, I think I'd pick him to win against Alex Morono. It's just hard to do that at this point in Nico Price's career. I'll take some underdog shots on Price solely because there are so few underdogs that I really like. And if Nico Price durability is able to hold up, I could see him finishing Alex Morono because Morono's pretty chinny in his own right. So Nico Price is one of the live underdogs on the card that I'm willing to get some exposure to, but not all that much. I only have 17%, which is slightly underweight to the field. I'm also underweight to the Morono side. Other fights that I like to target on this slate. I do think this fight is fairly likely to finish, but still, I think there's better fights that have higher scoring upside in a finish than this one. Should be a lot of finishes on the card. Randy Brown against Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos. And Dos Santos is another fighter who I have concerns about the age and durability on, because Dos Santos, he is now 37 years old. He's going to be turning 38 later on in the year. And I know he had a fight that a lot of people rated pretty highly last time out against Rinat Fakhretdinov, but Dos Santos got his ass kicked for the first couple of rounds and actually got his ass kicked so bad that Fakhretdinov just totally gassed out in the third round. So it wasn't as much that Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos did all that much in that fight. As much as he just survived for 2 rounds, Fakhretdinov gassed himself out, and then Dos Santos was able to really just beat up a punching bag in the third round to get a draw because the final round was a 10-8. And against Randy Brown is going to have physical advantages, kind of in a similar way that Kevin Holland has advantages over Mikhail Olashechuk. Randy Brown, 4 inches taller, also has a 5-inch reach advantage. I think he's going to be able to keep this fight at distance. I think he ends up winning the fight by decision. So not a fight that I have all that much interest in targeting. If I had to play one side, it would be on the Dos Santos side, just because he is cheaper and we have the issue with it being hard to find live underdogs. But Randy Brown to win by decision, and not a fight I really like all that much for DraftKings. Cesar Almeida taking on Roman Kopylov, and this is a fight that has seen a lot of line movement over the course of the last week. Let me see what we have now for the line at the time that I'm recording. Kopylov is plus money at some books now, and he had initially opened up at minus 175. Now anywhere from like plus 100 to plus 105 on the Kopylov side. And I don't really totally agree with the line movement. We saw Cesar Almeida make his UFC debut in his last fight. We had previously seen him on the Contender Series. He had a not really inspired win over Lucas Fernando, but one that did bring some concerns to me. Most notably, Lucas Fernando was able to land 3 takedowns. He also had nearly 6 minutes of control time in that fight. And then if you look at Cesar Almeida's UFC debut against Dylan Butka, who's another fighter that I'm not all that high on, Butka lands 3 of 6 takedowns. He also had 6 minutes of control time, and then he just totally gassed. So what ends up happening is Butka dominates the first. Dominates might not be the correct way to do it, but neutralizes Almeida in the first round just by blanketing him with pressure, pushes him up against the cage, gets some takedowns, gets some top control time. And Butka was able to do that for about a round and a half and just ran out of cardio and got gas finished. I don't think that's the case for Kopylov. The question I have about Kopylov, though, is will he look to wrestle against Cesar Almeida? Kopylov doesn't typically look to wrestle, but if he does, I expect him to have advantages. If you look at Roman Kopylov, we saw him land a takedown against Punahele Soriano. He landed a takedown against Albert Duraev. If he could take down Albert Duraev, he for sure could take down Cesar Almeida. The problem is that if he doesn't look to shoot takedowns, which once again, he doesn't do all that often, then Cesar Almeida is the better, more well-rounded striker. He's got a kickboxing background. He did beat Alex Pereira in a kickboxing fight at, I'm pretty sure that was 185 pounds, or the equivalent, like 182 pounds, whatever it ends up converting to for the closest kickboxing weight class over in Glory. But if Kopylov looks to land those takedowns, I think he wins, and I think he would look like a pretty significant favorite. I'm not looking to bet him because I'm not confident that's his game plan. But considering we have all this line movement on Almeida, he's also projected for more ownership. I think Kopylov's an interesting way to differentiate some of our lineups. We've got him projected for, where is it? Yeah, Kopylov projected for 25% ownership. Almeida projected for 33.4% ownership. So I'm coming in a little bit overweight to the field on Kopylov, a little bit underweight to the field on Cesar Almeida. I do think both these fighters are also live for a knockout in this fight, so that's another path to upside for each of them. But give me Roman Kopylov at lower ownership in a fight that I do think should be really competitive and where both fighters do have some upside in the mid-range. Next fight we have here, it is Jailton Almeida against Alexander Romanov, and Romanov has looked very unimpressive as of late. When he first came into the UFC, he was a really highly touted prospect with a sumo background. He was somebody who had a really interesting fight style as well, because he was kind of just steamrolling guys. You'd see him shoot takedowns. He was landing them pretty easily. And then he was throwing like King Kong double hammer fists at once to finish guys on the feet. So we saw him finish a handful of guys with just vicious ground and pound. The problem ended up being that once we saw Romanov actually tested, where fighters were able to offer some sort of resistance against him, he falls apart. He looked great in the first round against Marcin Tybura, arguably had a 10-8 first round against him, and just had nothing left in the tank for the second or third rounds. Then he fights Alexander Volkov, doesn't land takedowns against Volkov. I think he only shot 2. Oh, no, 5. So he goes 0 for 5 on takedowns in a couple of minutes, and then just quit. Wasn't able to land takedowns in a couple minutes and was like, fuck, I'm out of here. I can't do anything about this. And then Volkov just finishes him immediately. So Romanov lands 0 significant strikes, goes 0 for 5 on takedown attempts, just goes, I'll fight again and try to be better next time, which he kind of was to an extent against Blagoy Ivanov, but it also wasn't all that inspired of a win. So I think this is a pretty favorable matchup for Jailton Almeida, particularly because even though there is a sumo background for Romanov, he doesn't defend takedowns all that well. He only has 20% takedown defense. And we just saw a fight where Jailton Almeida did get finished by Curtis Blades, but the first round before Blades was able to finish him, Almeida went 9 of 12 on takedown attempts in the first round. And one thing about Romanov, if you got Jailton Almeida on top of you, Romanov isn't going to be getting up in the same way that Curtis Blades was able to get up against Jailton Almeida. He's not quite the same level of athlete or with the same wrestling pedigree that Curtis Blades has. So I like Jailton Almeida to land takedowns, and then I like him to get either a ground and pound or submission finish after he gets on top. The only concern here with Jailton Almeida, he's going to be very popular. He's projected for nearly 40% ownership. I have him in a third of my lineup, so he's somewhat of a priority for me as a spend-up option. I'm just having a difficult time creating unique lineups with all these spend-up options I like getting to because Islam is super popular. Strickland's really popular. Almeida's really popular. I like all of them, but I don't want to be playing lineups that are duped 100, 200 times by the field. So Almeida is the lowest priority option for me amongst the 3 chalk spend-up options. So between Strickland, Islam, and Almeida, I like all of them. I'm just coming in a little bit less on Almeida and prioritizing the other 2 a little bit more. The next fight that we have to talk about here, it is Grant Dawson against Joe Solecki. And I feel really good that Grant Dawson wins this fight. He's one of the biggest favorites on the card. And I think for a good reason. Joe Solecki doesn't have a lot of power in his hands. So I don't think there's all that much risk of Grant Dawson getting knocked out in this fight like he did last time out against Bobby Green. But then also Grant Dawson isn't always the best DraftKings scorer, at least not relative to some of the other pay-up options on the slate that we've already talked about. So this is one of my least favorite fights to target on the card. I don't think it has a ton of finishing equity. I think Grant Dawson probably lands takedowns. I think Joe Solecki might even invite the takedowns because if you look at Joe Solecki, he only has 50% takedown defense. One of the main reasons he only has 50% takedown defense is when guys go to shoot takedowns, Joe Solecki's so comfortable off his back that he'll just kind of accept the takedowns, and he's willing to play from guard, try to get submissions off of his back, and I think that's what ends up happening here. I think Grant Dawson gets minimally contested takedowns, and then it's just going to be a grappling match on the ground where I think Grant Dawson wins because he's going to be holding top position. One that I think could score okay on DraftKings, but there's just other payoff options with higher ceilings, and I don't have all that much interest in Joe Solecki. So I'll pick Grant Dawson to win by decision, but a low priority fight for me on DraftKings. Phil Rowe against Jake Matthews. And this is a super weird fight for me because Jake Matthews is so wildly inconsistent, where if you guys remember when he first broke into the UFC, which was a while ago, he was like 19 years old at the time. He was training out of his garage with his dad. That was all the way back in 2014. And after he had a couple of wins in the UFC, there was some hype around Jake Matthews, and there was a thought that he could eventually end up being a title contender. And then it was just inconsistent performances, like getting submitted by James Vick, builds himself back up, and then gets finished by Kevin Lee. And you just get to this point where, hey, he looks good for a couple of fights. There's a reasonable amount of confidence in Jake Matthews, and then he just ends up falling apart. His last fight against Michael Morales, that was one where he was just kind of overmatched against somebody who was much more physically imposing. Michael Morales is one of the top young prospects that we have in the division right now. So that's where I kind of don't know what to make of this fight, because I think Jake Matthews is the better fighter. I think he's more well-rounded. I just don't trust him to show up. I don't trust him to have a good game plan. For instance, the fight against Matthew Semmelsberger, Jake Matthews had a massive wrestling and grappling advantage. And he just didn't really shoot takedowns in that fight and just continually got hurt on the feet in that matchup. So the way I'm looking at this fight, Jake Matthews is so inconsistent and unreliable. And Phil Rowe is somebody who we've seen put away fighters. Phil Rowe has finishing equity. His recent wins, third round finish over Nico Price, second round finish against Jason Witt, second round finish against Orion Cosey, and then also he had a third round finish on the Contender Series against Leon Shabazian. That's Edmund Shabazian's brother. So if Phil Rowe wins, I do think the most likely path is going to be by finish. And considering we have a cheap fighter with finishing equity on a card with a lot of sketchy underdogs, I'm getting myself to exposure to Phil Rowe. Even though I don't rate him all that highly as a fighter, I have Phil Rowe in 30% of my lineups. He's not expected to be all that popular either, 22% projected ownership. So I think he's a good contrarian way to differentiate some lineups and save some salary or less pay up for some studs as well. The next fight here, Mickey Gall against Basil Hafez. Mickey Gall hasn't fought in the UFC in a while. We haven't seen him in just about 2 years when he fought against Mike Malott and ended up losing that fight by KO. And then previously he lost to Alex Morono. And we've seen Mickey Gall look good against some very, very low-level opponents. He beat Jordan Williams, although it was kind of a sketchy fight against Jordan Williams, which wasn't the best look for Mickey Gall. He beat Salim Touhari. He ended up beating George Sullivan. He beat Sage Northcutt. He has the win over CM Punk and Mike Jackson, the photographer. So very low-level wins for Mickey Gall. And Basil Hafez looked pretty good in his UFC debut, and also in a ridiculously difficult matchup. He took that fight against Jack Della Maddalena. If memory serves correct, Hafez took that fight on about a week's notice to take on a contender in JDM, and it went to a split decision. And now you're getting a much easier matchup for Basil Hafez against somebody in Mickey Gall, who they did fight in a grappling match. I think it was something like 8 years ago, but Hafez ended up winning that. He had posted about it on his social media accounts recently that he's looking to go 2-0 against Mickey Gall. And Basil Hafez also is extremely physically imposing. Also, these fighters are born within 9 days of each other, so basically the exact same age here. But considering what we saw out of Basil Hafez on short notice against JDM and how aggressively he looked to get that fight to the mat as well, Hafez landed, 3 of 20 takedown attempts. So yeah, it's not the highest percentage, but the fact that he was able to shoot 20 takedowns, he had the cardio to shoot 20 takedowns on short notice, had 6 minutes and 48 seconds of control time. I think he could have a lot of wrestling and grappling success against Mickey Gall. And also not all that much ownership expected to go to Hafez. So if you want to pay up for a fighter and get off of the ownership on fighters like Islam and Strickland, I do like getting to Basil Hafez. I have him in 35% of my lineup. So pretty big overweight stand for me on somebody who not only do I pick to win, but I think if he wins, should be in a way that scores very well on DraftKings. Couple fights left here to talk about. The next one is Eileen Perez against Jocelyn Edwards. One other thing that I want to let you guys know about is if you haven't checked out Betr, it's a pick'em DFS site. They have a free square for this weekend, over 0.5 significant strikes for Dustin Poirier. So if you do think that Dustin Poirier lands just one single significant strike, just one significant, doesn't have to win, doesn't have to finish him or anything. Just one strike landed by Dustin Poirier, and you win that play over on Betr. Just sign up with the promo code ODDS7. Capitalization doesn't matter, just ODDS7, and you get a deposit bonus also of up to $250 in addition to access to that free square. So just another way to get value on this card that I wanted to shout out to you guys. But anyway, a couple of fights left here. Eileen Perez against Jocelyn Edwards. I think this is another pretty good matchup for For Eileen Perez, she lands 4.89 takedowns per 15 minutes. And then Jocelyn Edwards only defends takedowns at a 64% clip. If this fight did take place on the feet, I think Edwards has a pretty big striking advantage. She also has a reach advantage of 4 inches. But we've seen Perez so aggressive looking for takedowns in the UFC that I think she should be able to land takedowns and find some success in that realm. We saw her in her last fight against Lucy Pudilova. She landed 2 of 8 takedowns, had 8.5 minutes of control time. I think this fight looks pretty similar to the fight against Pudilova. Just the only issue I have with Eileen Perez, other fighters that are pay-up options that I do think have higher ceiling. So picking Perez to win, I have some interest in her for DFS purposes, but not all that much. I have her in, let's see, I think it was like 20% of lineups. Yeah, 26%. So a little bit underweight to me on Eileen Perez. If you guys are playing like single entry or 2-3 lineups, she's not one of the fighters I would play in that kind of setting. And then Jocelyn Edwards, not really a punt option that I have all that much exposure to. She's just in a couple of lineups. And then finally, Mitch Raposo against Andre Lima. And this fight really annoys me because I liked Raposo. There are, and not to sound like a broken record, but not that many underdogs that I feel all that great about for this slate. So I did think that Mitch Raposo was a good target because he's somebody who has a wrestling background and he's taking on Andre Lima, who doesn't have the best takedown defense, defends takedowns at a 61% clip. He's coming off a super weird fight against Igor Severino where Lima got taken down 5 times. There was groin strikes in the fight. There was fence grabs. And then it ends because Igor Severino gets DQ'd in the second round for biting Andre Lima. So I go ahead, I rewatched that fight, and I'm thinking, I think Mitch Raposo could have success in the wrestling department against Andre Lima. And then what happens today? Andre Lima weighs in at basically the wrong weight class. For a 125-pound fight, he weighed in at 130 pounds. So he weighs in between the 125 and 130-pound weight classes. And the fight goes on. Minimal purse deduction for Andre Lima, he's probably fighting on like an 8-8 contract or something like that. So we got fined like 25% of his purse. Cool. Mitch Raposo is getting a couple extra $1,000 out of it. So essentially no real punishment to Andre Lima. And he's just going to be way bigger than Raposo now. So I still like the matchup on paper for Raposo, but the fact that Lima had such a big weight miss and is going to be potentially a lot bigger than Raposo, it's a problem for me. He lands 3.67 takedowns per 15 minutes against a fighter who doesn't defend takedowns all that well. But if there's just a massive size difference for Lima, that could really give him a competitive advantage in this fight. So I'm still overweight to Raposo. I have him in, let's see, where is he? Yeah, I've got Raposo in a little bit more than 21% of my lineups here, 21.3. And he's projected to be very contrarian, only 14.5% ownership. But I was expecting to have like 35% exposure to Raposo. I had to dial that back a little bit because of the weight miss by Lima. That gives me some concerns that Lima is going to have a big advantage in that department. And then also because Lima is going to be bigger and he already has a striking advantage, I think he's live to knock out Raposo. So it really sucks when fighters seemingly strategically miss weight to that extent. But I'm going to have to pick Lima to win when I otherwise would have been on Mitch Raposo. So kind of a bummer that happened. Takes one of my favorite punt options, not off the board for me, but did make me lower my exposure to him. So that's a roundup of everything for this slate. If you guys haven't done it yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Don't forget, if you want to sign up for any of the packages at Stokastic.com, sign up using the link below. It also comes with Discord access. You can ask me questions whenever you want. And for the free giveaway, comment below which fighter priced under 8K scores the most fantasy points. I'll randomly select one person who gets the answer correct, get a free Odd Shopper subscription. That's our betting site. Thank you guys very much for watching. Enjoy UFC 302, and I'll see you back here next week.